Greetings, sword friends. Today, let us take a look at this important trend in the development of modern reproduction swords. This Type 15A bastard sword, sent to me by Swordier. I think this is an important landmark in the history of modern reproduction European swords. According to my estimation, this sword has come further than any other entry-level swords made in China, India, and Eastern European countries. And it has done so many things right that other makers of this price point didn't manage to implement correctly in the past. Clearly, the intention here of Swordier is to provide a budget-friendly model that rivals the quality of premium reproduction swords such as Albion. Has it succeeded in its endeavor? We're going to find out in this video. Now, when we grew up in the 80s and 90s, reproduction European swords were extremely hard to find. You have to go for extremely pricey, custom, bespoke sword. And even so, those makers did not really know everything about it due to the lack of information exchange as the internet was still in its infancy. Now, there was an explosion of information about original antique European swords in the early 2000s. So you start to see, competent premium makers such as Albion and Angus Trim became extremely popular and able to offer extremely high quality reproduction medieval European swords. Now, in the following decade, the early 2000s, there started to be some premium makers such as Michael Tinker Pierce and Angus Trim offering competent designs for entry-level makers such as Hanway and Kingston Arms to make. Therefore, you have the notorious Hanway Tinker line that sells entry-level swords between $250 and $300 and offer competent designs implemented by their Chinese makers. But let's face it, these still have a historical construction. The fit and finish is sometimes left wanting, and the fittings are usually very plain, right? They are pseudo-historical, but it lacks the nuance of historical swords. Luckily, many of these swords can have custom-made fittings, and then you have hilt smiths such as Stephen Wirta basically spruce up the entire hilt, getting rid of the older plain and barely functional hilt, and put on these custom-made pommels and guards and handmade grips. But you still cannot correct some of the quirks in the blade, and I always suspect that Michael Tinker Pierce designs cannot be fully implemented by the makers such as Hanway with a budget, right? Like for the price point, they're just okay. The mass distribution is, mediocre. They move all right, but it lacks the original's handling traits because of the distal taper. That's not really prominent. Also, the profile is not the most iconic for its type, such as Type 18A. The degree of profile taper and the termination to the tip just basically look more like a Chinese jian than a European sword. This has changed in recent years as many budget-friendly entry-level makers started to collaborate more closely with figures in the industry such as Matt Easton and L.K. Chen. And they were able to do extensive research based on museum examples, antique originals, provide very detailed, not just measurements, right? Those are extremely important, but also, characteristics observed close up in person, right, at the museum. So that's very important for the development. Still, some of the products are quite pricey. They're no longer in the entry level. Some would say they are even, high-end, mid-range swords, kind of in between $600 and $800. So that's a shame because people have different expectations in that price point. Now, Swordier is a new sword making company formed in the past 2 or 3 years, and they started to offer medieval European sword designs. In the past year, they have improved quite a bit, offering several models that take heavy inspirations from premium quality modern reproductions, such as Albion swords, and then they have many details implemented correctly. And you look at this sword, they call it Type 18C, which is not really correct, as it's about the right length, just under 34 inches in blade length. But you can look at the base; it's not really very broad, close to 80 millimeters, definitely exceeding 3 inches wide on the originals. This one is around 60 millimeters, and it has a more triangular taper, resulting in a very acute needle point. And this is very iconic for Type 15A, the shorter variant, bastard swords that are usually found in the Castillon-Dordogne horde of swords, early half of the 15th century. On the upper portion, it doesn't really have the breadth of Type 18C, which is okay, but this is definitely more akin to the Castillon swords of Peter Johnson designs on modern reproductions, such as the Albion, Mercenary, Constable. You can see this, my own Albion Castellan. There's a lot of similarity between these, and I think the hilt length is appropriate, but the choice of the fitting is kind of questionable, which we're going to talk about. So the mass distribution of the blade is quite appropriate, quite well executed, has some really interesting traits comparing to the most iconic Type 15 and 15A, such as the Albion Lancaster that I have here and the Albion Castellan. It features a slightly more pronounced belly. Usually they have close to linear profile taper, meaning the rate of narrowing is quite constant until the last 3 or 4 inches. But this one here definitely is on curve. You look at the sword's profile from this angle, you can see it changes to become more drastic on the upper portion. So I would say this is definitely can be categorized as a crossover between Type 15A and Type 18A. On the upper portion is closer to 15A. The lower portion, near the base, it has a more, gradual, more subdued profile taper, the rate of narrowing. So kind of a crossover, but definitely appropriate for the Castillon swords. And there are some quirks that's odd about this sword, and we're going to talk about it. But it has done so many things right, such as the hilt. The grip length is not overly long. It's between 6 and 7 inches. So that's about right for the handle half portion of the Castillon swords. And you can see it has a very pronounced wasted geometry on the grip. So this is really well designed, taking heavy inspirations from many modern reproductions. Of course, they're obviously found on antique swords, both surviving examples from the museum, but also swords on paintings or sculptures. So that's the good thing about it. The choice of fitting is a little bizarre, right? For a layman, they look very historical, the flamboyant official pommel, not really flat from the side as well, has some tapering in the thickness, which is well done, and the geometry is really well executed. You can see the ebbs and flows here, and all the corners are rounded, edges are not, biting, so very ergonomic. The cross guard is the most strange part. It is the style of early to mid 15th century English and French Anglo-Franco arming sword guard, and scaled up. If you can look at my Albion Kingmaker here, which is a very iconic interpretation of this type of English and French arming sword, single-handed sword, and they are their guards proportion is correct for this kind of blade and hilt. But when you have to make it for kind of long sword or hand and half sword, they scale up this guard, which makes it a little bizarre looking. It doesn't really work if you just swap out random parts, hilt components, and scale them up and down. It's a little, kind of like an eyesore. Functionally, it's sound, and the implementation is good. The polish, satin finish matching the blade, the pommel, and you can see there's a correct tapering in the width and thickness. It has a geometry correctly implemented. It has this termination, usually just like a solid knob, but this one is perforated. I don't mind that at all. In fact, it adds some accent to the sword. But it just is so wide, right? The width would be appropriate for a longsword, but it has this extreme curve, which is kind of odd looking, and they scale up a lot, right? Meanwhile, if you look at the grip, it looks great, right? It has the correct geometry, right? The shape, silhouette, but it's just a little weird when you grip it this way. And you can see the upper portion of the grip is so short. It takes about half of the length, but your hand, your main hand, your pinky finger way, far exceeds the boundary of this central riser, the waist. And how did this happen? Because this grip is taken from a full-size longsword, blades of 37, 38-inch long. Therefore, you can have a longer grip, right? For the leverage, when you scale down the grip length to fit the dimension of the blade, and then you just scale down the 3D model wholesale. By the way, the core of this grip is ABS, high impact plastic. So obviously, when they want to 3D print, they just shrink the entire dimension, all the width, thickness, and length all together. Therefore, the upper portion becomes too short for your main hand. Not a huge problem, and you can still grip onto it, but the girth is a little bit too small, right, for even medium-sized hands. And the problem with that is that you might still have decent control of the edge alignment because it's relatively flat, on the side. So that's a good thing. However, because the girth doesn't really fit your hand, you can rotate the grip in your hand relatively easily, meaning that when you make some cut or change directions, the blade tends to roll in your hand, right? It doesn't happen always, but it can happen. Ideally, when you grip onto the sword tightly and you rotate the crossguard, it shouldn't really rotate much, and it shows that you have a good grip of the entire sword, control of the weapon, but not really the case, as you can see. Plus, this grip is mostly oval. Obviously, the cross-section changes because the width changes. The thickness, not as much. Pretty flat from the side, but it does change in girth. And when it meets the pommel, it's mostly cylindrical to fit the dimension of the stock of this fishtail pommel, which is okay, but it feels so small. And to implement this correctly, you can look at my Albion Castellan. See, the grip length is comparable to this Swordier sword, right? Hand and half sword, but the upper portion is so much longer compared to the lower portion because this is a short grip. You can't just scale down a full-size longsword grip in all dimensions, right? But other than that, I think the grip is well done. Has a very natural, leather dyeing color. The stitching is very prominent on the back, same as the scabbard stitching. Some people enjoy that. Some people enjoy the skied leather, right? Compressed more because you don't really feel the seam. To me, it doesn't really matter. It's functional and it doesn't look bad, right? The stitching is very cleanly done, so that's good. The leather quality seems high, I cannot verify whether this is genuine leather, but the grain put onto the surface is very well done. Looks like real cow leather. The core, like I said, is high impact plastic, very durable, but it doesn't absorb shock as well as wooden core, right? And that's just something you have to keep in mind. When you make a high impact hit, it's possible that there's a lot of hand shock transferred. And you can look at the pommel, it's really well done, right? It naturally lengthens the grippable space. So this is really helpful for hand-and-half swords. If you want to use as a single-handed sword, you can, right? Especially with the mass distribution on this blade. You want to use it in two hands, it's also possible because of the geometry of this fishtail pommel. But I would say that this kind of pommels are usually found on longer bladed long swords, Germanic or Northern Italian ones. So it's a little odd. You have like a German or Northern Italian pommel, and then you have the English and French style guard but scaled up. You have longsword style grip but scaled down. And everything, all the transitions are done correctly. There's no hot spot. All the edges are very well chamfered, right? This is laudable. Designer clearly has handled many premium level historical sword reproductions. So the attention to detail, right, of these ergonomic aspects are great, but it's just the choices of these hilt components are kind of bizarre, right? If you look at the pin here, I would say functional, but the shaping is a little sloppy, right? This falters in comparison with high-end swords like Albion, where they could pin it very cleanly and then polish the entire bottom of the pommel to make it flush. This is not it. You can even see some of the edges of the opening for the tan to go through, but it holds the pommel in place, right? And then you can see the pin when it hammers in, it cracked a little bit. Shaping is just not great, but it's functional. It's definitely a difficult one to implement to get it right because of the geometry of the fishtail pommel. Fishtail pommel changes in thickness, it tapers, so it's not really flat or boring. And I would say the central channel, the transition to the opening of the tail, it's a little bit jarring, could be done better, but at this price point, is it really possible? I don't know, but it will add some challenge to the polishing for sure. But overall, the pommel is really well done. Now let's look at the blade. Man, this is probably the most important part, right? You can observe that it really reached that premium quality because of the silhouette, right? This is very rarely found on Chinese-made reproductions. But let's face it, even on some premium reproduction makers work, they are still, sometimes wonky. The transition to the tip, it's very sudden, and they don't really implement this needle point correctly. You have to do a very gradual transition, right, to the tip. Profile taper. It's like a universal. It's on a curve. It cannot be terminating to a wider section and then suddenly tapers off in width. Doesn't look so great, such as this Hanwei Tinker sword. You can see the tip geometry. Yeah, they're kind of different types, but type 18 should have a more acute tip than this, right? You have antique examples with dollar points, but they're just not as iconic, right? And you can see the Swordier example has come so much further, right, than the entry-level swords previously designed and made. Therefore, it carries the correct mass distribution in this dimension. And the most difficult part, I would say, for the entire blade is the distal taper. You can look at a picture and see the profile is done right or not, but it's very difficult to look at the distal taper, the change of thickness, how gradual it is. Is it linear? Is it convex or concave tapering? And there's a lot of nuance, because if you don't do it correctly, the mass distribution will be off. So how does this one perform? Well, the base is at 6 millimeters, which is good because it's rather wide at 60 millimeters in width, very appropriate for Castillon group of swords, right? And then it doesn't taper much in the thickness, down to just under 5 millimeters at the midpoint of the blade. Because it tapers so much in the profile, that will be okay. But then from this point on, you can almost see in thickness, there's a very gradual, very pronounced change of tapering in the thickness. And it tapers to about 2.5 millimeters at 2 inches, 5 centimeters from the tip, which is okay. And I can't tell you the specific measurement of other premium swords. I can tell you, I measured my Albion Castellan, and it also features a convex distal taper, meaning that on the lower portion, it's much slower than the tapering of the thickness on the upper portion. And this will be okay because the blade is more triangular, right? So it loses a lot of width on the upper portion. So you still want to keep it a little rigid, right? You don't want to taper down in thickness that fast. But it just, on this one, it's a little strange. I would expect this one with the profile and distal taper and the cross section, very prominent diamond cross section. It should handle a little bit more nimbly, right? It just feels a little, I wouldn't say tip heavy, a little, smashy, right? Whereas Type 15A swords should be relatively precise, right? In the point, you can see this is one of the examples where you have a very efficient thrusting tip. Especially the overall blade is so rigid, right? This is early to mid 15th century, and plate armor became very prevalent. So you always have to have good capacity, to combat armor-wearing components. Half swording to jab into the gap of the plate armor. So if you have a point, not just a point, the section under the point too wide, you're gonna have difficulty, going into the gap, right? It has to be thick and narrow. So it did that right. But when you do cutting, man, there's a lot of authority, and which you wouldn't really expect from Type 15A swords, right? All the Type 15 and 15A swords I own, modern reproductions, Albion, Ringneck, Castellan, Lancaster, they have mass distribution closer and center of gravity closer to your hand, to the hilt. Whereas this one, surprisingly, has a little bit far out point of balance at 5 inches from the guard. And not just the beak, right? Like the central ridge of the guard. It's the regular thickness from here. Therefore, it just feels, I would say, mid-heavy. The mid-section is heavy because it really isn't the most stereotypical Type 15A, right? On the mid-section, midpoint, is still at over 40 millimeters in width and 5 millimeters in thickness. This shows that it has a good rigidity, very, very rigid blade, right? Good for thrusting, definitely. But you flex the blade, definitely it's made of spring steel, very durable. And you can see the dynamics is kind of bizarre on this one. The center of percussion, right, where it remains mostly static, when you flex the blade, is over here. So that's a little low, right? But then, the ideal cutting portion, it has a good width, I would say. Up here, it's too narrow for it to cut, really cleanly. It's more of parrying coverage and the reach to threaten your opponents with the point. Here, it has the width to taper down the edge bevel, so still very effective in cutting. And also, just the dynamics, harmonics of the sword. You can see when I flex the blade, my hand vibrates quite a bit, and it shouldn't be, because good harmonics dictate that the node up here where you cut the most with should be static mostly, and here where your main hand grips onto the sword should be also static, where my hand vibrates a lot here, right? Coupled with the fact that it uses high impact plastic core rather than wooden core, could be some discomfort, but we shall see in test cutting. Okay, the grind quality is really high, right? You can look at the surface of the blade, has some very minor rippling. The central ridge is very, very straight. The blade, both edges are very symmetrical. And termination on the tip is definitely premium quality, right? Needle point, very pointy, very cute, right? The angle is. So those are also definitely, very desirable traits. Previously, that wouldn't be found on anything other than the highest quality reproduction swords, custom swords. So I'm very happy with this, right? It really shocked me with the quality. Also, you look at the blade surface finish, very, very even satin. You can't really make out the tool marks. So this is very akin to, premium reproductions made in North America or Europe. So kudos to Swordier, but it's just the handling trace. It's very good, right? But it defies my expectations of a Type 50A sword. That's kind of unexpected. The edges, I was told that Swordier is capable of outputting edges very keen, right? Very good apexing. But this one here is interesting. Has a diamond cross section. You obviously can taper from the central ridge to the edge, like in a straight line. That will make the edge angle very sharp, but it will reduce the overall durability of the edge. So it's kind of a trade-off, right? The correct way, the historical way to do this is to just have some apple seating, right? Just round it off slightly, have a very minor convex geometry, just above the edge, right? Not the secondary bevel. And this one implements to the T, right? It's just like Albion swords. You can see the apple seating just behind the edge. But overall, the bevel is very flat. It's a flattened diamond cross section. What really shocked me is the apexing of this sword is not really that adequate. It's not really that sharp. And you can see it doesn't really bite onto your skin or anything. I did a paper cutting test. It could cut, not very smoothly, but there are some dollar sections, see on the edge. This is very akin to premium reproduction swords made in the US or Europe. They don't usually output very sharp blades, and I don't know why there's no historical precedence of this. We know that for a fact. Knights were almost paranoid of edges not being constantly sharp, so they were always asking their servants and squires to check the edge and hone them, especially after fights, right? Edge weapon, they have to be able to cut, right? Especially late medieval times, everybody are afforded with gambeson, very, very tough textile protection, or at least arming doublets, arming shows. So your edges have to be razor sharp. Otherwise, you can hit them. It wouldn't do that much. Maybe some bruises, some minor fractures if you're lucky on the bone, on the bony part. But that's not the strength of swords, right? So you really want to keep honing the edge. However, in modern times, like Albion, Angstrom, I hate to say this, I love their swords, but their edges are just not adequate. I think they leave that part to customers. You can sharpen them for sure. So almost everybody going to cutting competitions, if they use Albion swords or Angstrom, they will hone not just hone, they have to sharpen their edges. Sometimes even some reprofiling near the edge. I was hoping that Swordier could offer adequate level of sharpness out of the box, but this is not really that sharp. This is moderately sharp, as I can describe. It wouldn't take much to sharpen this. Edge geometry is excellent, but it's kind of missed the opportunity. They could have offer very sharp edges. So overall, the entire sword is of good quality, but has some questionable choices, both the design and implementation. It definitely punches beyond its price point, right? It's $350 and $400 this range. Entry level, higher end entry level, lower end of the mid range. So the value proposition is extremely good. And then tossing a scabbard, not minimalist kind. It's wood core, not plastic anymore. You can see a little bit too thick for my taste. Medieval scabbards should not be bulky. They should be relatively thin, well made, using well seasoned poplar core or other good wood, appropriate, would not contract when the weather changes, right? And usually they are leather bound, right? And this one is. The leather they use is similar to the leather used for the grip binding, and you can see here it has risers carved onto the wood, or maybe a band that's glued to the wooden core. So it's really good looking for sure, but it's a little bit too thick for my taste. So it adds quite a bit of mass, and the silhouette of the scabbard doesn't really fit the blade. It should be very tapered. I think it can taper a little bit more, right? On the other hand, the fitting they put on, the shape, very simple, stainless steel, effective, and all the edges, corners are rounded down. It won't lash onto your clothing, etc. And minimal maintenance as well. And, the tip is very rounded, so it's all great, right? Doesn't have a throat or locket, which is historical for this period, and it has some leather, components sewn onto the upper portion, right, to offset the lack of locket. And these leather pieces, or the darker colored, they have, stamped patterns of foliage or floral patterns. And here you have griffin, which is kind of modern looking. It doesn't really look like medieval aesthetics. More like sigils found in video games or TV shows like Game of Thrones, like those medieval aesthetics, but modern implementation. Still, it's very good looking. It adds accent, adds character to the scabbard. The buckle and the belt, it's good attachment. I don't think it's strictly historical, but it does add messers for you to attach to a belt so you can wear it. But even if you just hold it, it's very comfortable. The leather offer good amount of traction, and you can hold it here. You sheath a sword. It's very comfortable, right? It's a little tight, right? When it goes in, and you have to give it a little push, and then the sound, reverberation is very satisfying. And we draw it, not very smooth, a little tight, but just give it a tug, it will come out. Definitely fits quite well, wouldn't fall out at all because it's tight, very secure. I enjoy that, and it has the appropriate amount of decor, on this scabbard. For this price point, it's really a steal. So you get a very high quality sword that has good design, excellent implementation. I'm really surprised by the capability, the competence of the smiths and craftsmen working on this model. Some of the weird choices of fitting, it can be overlooked. If you're just an enthusiast, not a hardcore historian, you wouldn't notice it, right? People in general, the general population, they look at this, they will think it's a very historical looking sword, right? Looks like ones from the museum. They wouldn't really tell the dissonance created by these specific choices, right? It's a combination of Hilt components. It doesn't really fit. I guess you can call it a bastard sword. That's what it is, right? Like taking components, blades, pommel guards from different, cultures, sword making cultures, and mix them together, which happened in history, like the Longsword housed at the Brescia Museum. That's German blade, passau blade, but more Italian style. But it's, the choice of fitting is very unique, right? You don't see it elsewhere anymore on other period examples. So I guess you can categorize this one as a bastard sword like that. So not really that big of a problem, but it just shows, I would say, the lack of experience handling antique original swords from that period by the designer. But it might not be a problem to you at all. And performance-wise, I don't know about other models by Swordier. This one here, it's a little heavy, chunkier than I wanted, but still it's very good. It's not hilt heavy, it's not tip heavy. You feel every inch of the blade moving. You have very decent control over the tip. So when you put it like a cut, you can definitely, direct the point to where you want it to be. Yeah, very stable, a little mid-heavy. So that can be addressed. But if you lower the overall mass, I would expect that the rigidity of the blade also falls a little bit, right? So it's kind of a trade-off. You want a more rigid sword for stable cutting and very, reliable thrusting, or you want it to be a little bit nimbler. And so you're gonna have a easier time when you control, do fencing moves, right? And this one here, it's a little stout, and I didn't really expect that. However, the quality of the forging, grinding, the hilt fit and finish, all the terminations and the joints are really well done. I look at the photos, I expect it to be high in quality. All the check boxes, they got the correct memo, right? But in person, it really exceeds my expectation in that front. So I would think that this is definitely a very competent model, right? Like if you can sharpen the blade, you're gonna have a good time. And for Swordier, I would advise them to, consult more experts when they design swords, right? Like the scale down of the longsword grip is a little bit lazy. You should find the correct dimension rather than just have a good, model for a full-size longsword, and then you shrink it down in all dimensions. Now it's a little bit too narrow and too thin, right? It's no longer, it rotates in your hand more easily. So that's easily fixed, right? On the design front. Other than that, the thing they've been doing, they'll keep doing it, right? It's getting better and better in recent model designs. So I would say for the price they offer, you're gonna have a blast. Let's look at some of the cutting footage and see how it performs with factory sharpness. After doing some cutting, finally I can diagnose what the problem is. The sword is mysteriously heavy, 1450 grams for its size. As a reference, the LB and Castellan is of the exact same size, and it weighs about 1,280 grams. So I feel the edge geometry and the cross section of the blade. I can tell that there's a lot of steel, a lot of muscle. So this is a very stiff, very rigid blade, which is good for thrusting, right? But you feel the edge, especially on the upper portion, it just isn't sharp, right? Like the apexing is not there. You don't feel the bite. You can do this, right? There's no problem at all. And then the edge, giving so much convex apple seating geometry, you think it's gonna be very durable, right? But I can already see here where I made a few mistakes, cutting onto the cap of the carton, plastic. The edge already rolled some. There's some deformation. So it also, begs the question, what the point is for making the edge geometry so stout, therefore adding so much steel onto the flattened diamond cross section, because the thickness is actually at the central ridge is very adequate. So you don't actually need to make the edge, the section near the edge, so stout, so thick. Yet somehow they got the memo that these diamond cross section needs very pronounced apple seating near the edge. It's just excessive, right? When you do that, you leave the overall bevel very, very thick. The angle, not just near the edge, right? Because you then inflate the rest of the edge bevel from the spine, central ridge, essentially, to the edge. So now it carries so much more steel. Well, yeah, it has a benefit of making the blade extra rigid, but then you just don't have good edge geometry for cutting performance, which may not be a problem. Some of the Castillon Dordogne group of swords, they are very, very hefty, thrusting oriented swords. So, and they are used by heavily armored combatants against heavily armored men-at-arms. So it's not necessarily ahistorical, but as a modern product, you make the shore blade very sharp, and supposedly you're gonna have a good time with such a nimble blade, easy to generate speed, but there's so much extra mass on the blade. If you enjoy doing test cutting, just be aware of that. This is not the perfect product for that kind of activity. If you want to do that, obviously you can, invest your time on reprofiling the entire blade, basically, and you're gonna create a sharper edge and with better, keener apexing. Without that, this just simply wouldn't do very well. This much. Wow, broke the tip. Broke the tip over here.
somewhere along the line. It's probably inside a coconut.
So the tip ends up breaking a 1/4 inch off, which is a shame given how graceful the transition of the silhouette is to the needle point. I think the culprit is the blade gets too thin where it became quite narrow. Whereas if you compare this to a properly designed sword such as the Albion Castellan or the Albion Ringneck, you can see it remained very thick, even right behind the tip, very point. Essentially, there is a swelling of the thickness where it reaches the tip, a reinforced tip, if you will. This is much needed for any sword or dagger with a needle point. It needs that beefy and reinforced tip geometry to remain durable when you jab into the gap of plate armor or through the rings of mail armor. That's something Swordier should consider. The profile, the silhouette is great. Still, this is usable, right? Where it broke off, you can grind it somewhat. You lose about 1/4 inch reach, but it's still very acute and deadly. And now it's a little bit thicker.
So, for the price they charge, this sword is, I would say, a steal. And if they could correct some of the design oversights, it would be a very competent model, just cost effective, right? You basically get premium quality with an entry level or mid-range, lower mid-range price. So very happy about this model, but I think there's room for improvement for sure. So Swordier type 15A, not 18C sword. So official Pommel. If you enjoyed this review, find any value or entertainment, please like and subscribe.